I found out my father was on life support from a voicemail that cut off mid-sentence, and when I rushed back home after years away, the house I grew up in was empty. My mother wouldn't answer my calls, and my siblings were nowhere to be found. I was standing in the hospital hallway, staring at a man who looked nothing like the strong father I remembered. Machines breathing for him, wires everywhere, and I remember thinking, how did my life come to this without me even knowing? Was I wrong for leaving in the first place? Or were they wrong for disappearing when he needed us most? I'm still asking myself that question, and honestly, I want you to tell me what you would have done in my place. Because even now, years later, it still doesn't sit right with me. When I left home, I swore I'd never come back. That probably sounds dramatic, but at the time it felt like survival. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew your business, and our family business was always chaos. My dad, Robert, worked himself into the ground at a factory. 12-hour shifts, overtime whenever he could get it. My mom, Linda, stayed home for most of my childhood, raising me and my 2 younger siblings, Mark and Emily. From the outside, we probably looked like a normal working-class family, but inside the house, everything was tense all the time. Money was always short, tempers were always high, and silence was our default language. My dad wasn't abusive, not physically at least, but he was distant, exhausted, and emotionally unavailable. My mom filled that space with criticism and control. Nothing was ever good enough. Not my grades, not my attitude, not my plans for the future. I was the oldest, which meant I was expected to be the example and the backup parent. If Mark got in trouble at school, it was somehow my fault. If Emily cried, I was supposed to fix it. By the time I was 17, I felt like I was already 40, burned out and angry at a world that hadn't even started for me yet. The night everything finally broke was after one of the worst fights I'd ever had with my mom. She told me I was selfish for wanting to leave town for college, that I was abandoning the family, that I thought I was better than them. My dad just sat there at the table staring at his plate, not saying a word. That silence hurt more than anything she said. I packed a bag that night, slept at a friend's house, and left for college a week later with barely a goodbye. At first I told myself the distance was temporary, that once things cooled down, we'd talk it out. But weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. Calls became texts. Texts became holiday messages. And eventually, even those stopped. I built a new life in another city. I worked my way through school, got a decent job, made friends who felt more like family than my own ever had. Whenever I thought about home, I felt a mix of guilt and relief. Guilt, because I knew my parents were getting older, and my siblings were growing up without me. Relief, because I wasn't drowning in that constant tension anymore. Every now and then, I'd look at my phone and think about calling my dad. We'd never been close, but there were moments from my childhood that stuck with me. Him teaching me how to ride a bike, running alongside me until I didn't need him anymore. The way he'd quietly slip me a few extra dollars when my mom wasn't looking. But every time I thought about calling, I remembered that night at the dinner table, the way he chose silence, and I'd put the phone down again. The voicemail came on a random Tuesday afternoon. I was at work, half listening to a meeting, when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, curiosity got the better of me. It was a nurse. She said my name, confirmed my identity, and then said, "Your father has been admitted to St. Mary's Hospital. He's currently in critical condition and on life support. We've been trying to reach your mother and siblings, but we were told you're next of kin as well. Please call us back as soon as possible." The message cut off there. I don't remember much of the rest of that day. I know I left work early. I know I called the number back about 10 times before someone finally answered. I know I booked the first flight home I could find. When I landed, it felt like stepping into a past life. The airport hadn't changed much, but I had. The drive to the hospital was a blur of familiar streets and old memories. I kept thinking my phone would ring, that my mom or one of my siblings would finally reach out, explain everything, apologize for not telling me sooner. It didn't. At the hospital, a doctor took me aside and explained that my dad had suffered a massive stroke. They didn't know how long he'd been alone before someone found him. There was significant brain damage. They couldn't make any promises. Walking into his room was one of the hardest things I've ever done. He looked smaller, weaker, nothing like the man who used to come home covered in grease and exhaustion. I held his hand cold and unresponsive, and for the first time in years, I cried for him. I cried for the conversations we never had, for the years I missed, for the fact that he might never wake up to hear me say I was sorry. After a while, a social worker came in and asked about my family. When I told her my mom and siblings should be here, She gave me a look that I still don't fully understand. She said they had been contacted multiple times. They knew, they just hadn't come. I felt something twist in my chest, a mix of anger and disbelief. I left the hospital that night and drove straight to my childhood home. The house was dark. The lawn was overgrown. A for sale sign was staked into the front yard. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at it, trying to process what I was seeing. When I finally got out and knocked on the door, a stranger answered. He told me he'd bought the place a few months ago. My parents had moved out. He didn't know where. Standing there, I realized how completely cut off I was. I didn't even know where my own family lived anymore. Over the next few days, I tracked them down piece by piece. Mark was living 2 towns over, working construction. Emily was in college, ironically not far from where I'd gone myself. My mom was living in a small apartment, downsized, as she put it later. When I finally got Mark on the phone, his voice was defensive from the start. He said Dad had been sick for a while, that the stroke wasn't entirely unexpected. He said Mom couldn't handle hospitals and that Emily was too young to deal with it. When I asked why no one told me, he said, "You left. You made it clear you didn't want to be part of this family." That sentence hit me harder than anything else so far. I wanted to scream that I was 17, that I was hurting, that I never meant forever. Instead, I hung up and went back to the hospital. Sitting by my dad's bed, listening to the steady beep of machines, I felt like I was the only one left who still cared. I talked to him, told him about my life, my job, the places I'd been. I told him I forgave him for not standing up for me, even if I wasn't sure I fully meant it yet. About halfway through that week, I realized I was going to have to make some decisions. The doctors needed consent for certain procedures. Legally, my mom was next of kin, but she wasn't answering their calls either. So that was the situation I was in. Standing alone in a hospital room, years of resentment and love tangled together, and I had to decide how far I was willing to go for a family that seemed to have walked, away from both me and my dad. Before I tell you what I did next, I want you to pause for a second and think about what you would have done in my shoes. Would you keep trying to pull your family together? Or would you protect yourself and walk away again? Let me know, because this is where everything changed. I made the choice to stay. I signed what I could, advocated for my dad, and made it clear to the hospital staff that I would be present every day. A few days later, my mom finally showed up. She looked older, smaller, like life had worn her down in ways I hadn't seen before. The moment she saw me, her face hardened. She didn't hug me. She didn't ask how I was. She asked why I was there. I told her he was my father. She said, "You gave up that right when you left." That's when years of bottled-up anger finally came out. I told her she didn't get to erase me, that I was a kid who needed support and didn't get it. I told her that disappearing and selling the house without telling me was cruel. She cried then quietly and admitted she was overwhelmed, that caring for my dad as his health declined had broken her, that she resented me for escaping when she felt trapped. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing I'd ever get. Mark and Emily came separately. Mark avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable. Emily hugged me and cried, saying she'd missed me and didn't know how to reach out. Seeing them all there finally felt surreal. We were together, but the distance was still there, invisible and heavy. A week later, my dad passed away. He never woke up. We stood around his bed as the machines were turned off, and I held his hand until it went still. At the funeral, people from the factory came up to me and told stories about him I'd never heard. About his kindness, his work ethic. It made me realize how little I'd truly known him, and how much time we'd all wasted. After everything settled, there were practical matters. My mom wanted to handle the estate alone. I didn't fight her. I didn't want money or the house that was already gone. What I wanted was closure. Before I left town again, I went to my dad's grave by myself. I told him I was proud of him. I told him I was sorry I wasn't there sooner, and I told him I was done carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations. I still talk to my siblings now, cautiously. My relationship with my mom is polite but distant. I've accepted that some wounds don't fully heal. They just scar over. Coming home after years away and finding my dad on life, support forced me to confront everything I'd been running from. And it taught me that walking away can protect you, but it also costs you. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that silence can do more damage than anger. And time doesn't fix what we refuse to face. If you were on my side, if you think I did the best I could with what I had, go ahead and like this video. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this, because trust me, life has a way of throwing them at you when you least expect it. And share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments, because I genuinely want to know what you would have done. I'll see you all in the next story.